you.
Thank you, Lou. And thanks to Scott and to Bill and to Peter for setting up their room. To Diane and Rick, who are upstairs greeting people, and I trust will be down here shortly. I think you all know, but this is the first in the 2024 series of Great Decisions talks. One half of which deal with individual countries or regions, one half deal with kind of transnational issues or problems, developments. That one of the most delightful aspects of coordinating this program with Lou each year is I get a chance to invite, which is a polite way of saying twist the arm of my friends, to participate as the speakers to kick off discussion. A reminder that the topics are key to those in the Great Decisions workbook, which is prepared by the Foreign Policy Association. It's not necessary to buy the book or to read the articles, but the sessions are freestanding. But if you're interested in additional information, sometimes a different take on the topics, the Great Decisions workbook is a place to go. The format tonight, I've asked our speaker, Abbas Milani, to talk for about 40-45 minutes. And then we will open it up to questions, people in the room and people in Zoom land. That I'm very much looking forward to this. Abbas Milani is the director of the Iran Studies program at Stanford and the co-director and founder, I guess, of the Iran Democracy Program at the Hoover Institution. We've known one another for many years. Every time I persuade him to speak in one of my groups, I learned something, and I'm looking forward to learning from him again tonight. And I will not take any more of your time. I'm going to slide into the audience. Abbas, thank you for doing this. Tell us about the Middle East.
Thank you all for coming in this rainy day, and in a sense, in this gloomy day. Because once I heard the news about what Mr. Putin did to one of his opponents, who I know is a friend of our joint friend, Mike McFall, it really made for a bad day. And my only consolation was that I was coming to this meeting. Tom says he has to twist our hands. I have to say our arms. I have to say that for me, one of the best days of the year, I really honestly mean that, is the day that I come and spend a couple of hours with you, because to know that there are people like you in this world, people who believe in something, people who believe in justice, and want to understand the world and contribute to the world, is what makes the world tolerable. There is a lot of evil lurking and loitering in this world today. I think it's one of the darkest moments I have ever experienced. Thus I do at least, I cling to any evidence that the evil forces have much to contend with. And one of the things they have to contend with is people like you. And I also have to say, as I say this every time that I have the pleasure of talking with you, that it's groups like you that I think preserve democracy in this country. The civil society that preserves democracy in this country. And one of the reasons, to me at least, that it is a gloomy time is that I think democracy is also challenged. It's in a moment that is being challenged globally. And in all the years that I have lived in this country, and now I have lived almost 2/3 of my life in this country, 10 years as a student, 11 years as a student, than now 35 years since I came back from Iran. I have never seen American democracy as periled as it is today. I've never seen American society as divided as it is today. And I've never seen American society as almost oblivious to some of the dangers that I think are very, very clear and evident. And in that gloomy atmosphere, to know that there are people like you, there are elements of civil society, there are organizations like this who think about the world and try to understand the world and try to problem solve the world with about the world is, I think, one of the few points of light. So I'm honored, and I have to thank you. I have to thank Tom that allows me to share in this remarkable experience. I'm going to talk about the Middle East, and I'm going to try to talk more about Iran, that I know a little more about. But Iran is now at a nexus of almost everything that happens in the Middle East. So if we talk about the Middle East, invariably we have to talk about Iran. And I think the Middle East is undergoing one of the most profound changes that I have ever seen. Certainly in all the years I have studied it. And certainly I think since World War II, the changes that are about to happen or are happening in the Middle East on the landscape in the Middle East are to me as profound, as strategic, as almost tectonic as they were in 45. In a sense, the Middle East changed after 45. The Middle East, till 41, if you will, was dominated to a great extent by Britain, to a lesser extent by Russia and Soviet Union. Certainly all the way to 1917, Iran was the domain of competition between England and Russia, both greedy colonialist, both rapacious colonialist. And of the two, by far the most rapacious was Russia. It was Russia that essentially took about a third of Iran's territory in the Caucasus. It was Russia that almost twice, once in 21, where they actually created the Soviet Socialist Republic in parts of Iran. And then in 1941, where they created another virtual Soviet Socialist Republic. The second one did not happen essentially because the United States didn't allow it to happen. And it's from 45 where the new landscape that I'm talking about in the Middle East, the landscape less dominated by Soviets and Russia and Britain, and more shaped by US policy. Iran certainly was that case. Iran, after 45, is much more in tune with what the US policy is than what the British policy is. There is a general misperception that after 45, the British essentially left Iran and left it in the hands of the Americans. That's a misperception. Iran from 45 to 79 was very much in a kind of a domain that shifted between domination of the US and or Britain. There was a very important difference between the way US behaved in Iran and the way Britain behaved in Iran. Britain was completely mercantilist about its influence in Iran. They didn't care about anything other than oil. And after World War II, selling weapons to Iran, selling other commodities to Iran. The US clearly, unambiguously, I think, from the moment they got involved in Iran, certainly had economic interests, certainly were interested in oil, certainly were interested in selling weapons to Iran, having more share of the Iranian economy, but they were also clearly, systematically, much more than England, interested in promoting democracy in Iran. part of our narrative about U.S. role in Iran has been shaped in the Cold War by either Soviet propaganda or Marxist propaganda. Marxist propaganda that I, as a young man, for example, when I was a student at Berkeley and I was a leftist, very much partook of. The narrative that said the United States was an imperialist force in Iran, the United States was supporting the authoritarian regime in Iran, and the United States had no interest other than selling oil, buying oil cheaply and selling arms expensively. That I think, and I think I've shown in a book called Shah that I've written about that period, mostly based on American archival documents. That's a simplification. But U.S. was very much the dominant force. And if in the Q&A you want, I can describe much more. I can talk about even the event that is sort of the great sin of the U.S., the 1953, the supposed U.S. role in the overthrow of a democratically elected government of Mossadegh. As I have argued in the Shah book, the reality is much, much more complicated than this simple Manichaean view that there was this democratic angel called Mossadegh, and there was this evil force called the CIA, the MI6, and they overthrew Mossadegh using a bunch of prostitutes and a bunch of pimps. Literally, that's the narrative that came out. The reality is much, much more complicated. But nevertheless, till 79, the US is very much the dominant presence in, I think, Iran, certainly in the rest of the Middle East. And the USSR then is very much trying to get in, is competing, it's trying to find a base, it is fighting the US, it finds a little foothold in first Afghanistan and Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and it becomes a formidable presence, but still a presence dominated or overshadowed by the US. China is nowhere to be seen, essentially. The first time China begins to get interested in Iran, literally, is 1971. From late 60s, early 70s, the Shah ruled Iran till 79, begins to triangulate. He wanted to be a little more flexible in the way he dealt with the United States and with England and with Soviet Union. So he established ties with post-Cultural Revolution China. So you begin to see hints of China influencing Iran. You could see that China was beginning to support some of the armed movements in the region. China was the key supporter of a movement that in the district of Zofar almost created a communist state right on the Persian Gulf. The supporter for that communist movement was China, but China was very discreet about it. Russia was also helping. But they came at one time, they controlled 75% of Yemen. And of Oman, I'm sorry, of Oman. And it was, so they supported some of the radicals, the Chinese, but mostly they tried to find a foothold with places like Iran. China at the time developed this theory that the world is divided in three parts. The first world was Soviet Union, that they called the socialist imperialist. The second was American imperialism. These are the two superpowers. They're competing for power. And of the two, the Chinese believed, even then, that the Soviet Union is the more dangerous, that America is declining. I'm talking about 70s. Soviets are rising. Remember, in 72, by one account, there are 42 civil wars where US and China are on different sides of the war throughout the world, in Africa, in parts of Latin America, in Middle East. And the Chinese are watching, and they developed this theory. And their notion was that the first world are the two superpowers. America is in decline, Soviet Union is in the growth, and that's the more important danger. Then there is a second world, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Australians, the New Zealanders. They're trying to stay afloat, fighting against these two superpowers. And then there is the rest of the world, the third world. And China said, we are a small part of this third world. And our job, they said at the time, was to find people who are trying to fight these two superpowers and support them. And one of the countries they found and they thought was fighting these two superpowers was Iran. Till 70, China was supporting a Maoist group in Iran. Maoist groups, some of which were active in Berkeley. They were being supported by the Communist Party of China. These groups would send people to China. They would get trained in Marxism. They would get trained in guerrilla warfare, and then go back to their country, in this case, Iran. The group that I was part of was actually in contact with the Chinese in late 60s. And then suddenly the Chinese stopped. They said, we're going to support the Shah. He is fighting imperialism. This is 1971. So from 71 to 79, the Chinese are trying every which way they can to find a foothold in Iran. The Russians have already found one. The Russians agreed to sell to Iran what Iran wanted, was a steel mill, and Iran agreed to sell them gas. So China and Russia both had a presence in Iran, but still by 79, the present and obvious force was the United States. The revolution changed that. The 1979 revolution came. The US actually, again, if you want, I can discuss this in great detail. There's tons of documentation from American archives. The US decided to, at one time, late 78, that the Shah can't stay, that they should help transition to a next government, and they very much helped, very instrumentally helped Khomeini come to power, thinking that of all the alternatives, this is the least bad. Remember, this is still the era of the Cold War, and if you can get a religious force right next to Soviet Union that is anti-communist, that is going to block this communist incursion into Iran, this might be better than a military option. This might be better than a democratic option, neither of which the US began to think could withstand a Soviet incursion. But Khomeini fooled the Iranian people as they fooled the US. One of the first things he did is occupy the American embassy and began a very systematic effort in anti-Americanism, and began a very serious effort to inching Iran towards more and more alliance with the East. Now, one of the earliest slogans of the revolution, Khomeini's slogan, was neither East nor West, meaning we don't want allegiance and alliance with the US. We don't want an alliance with the Soviet Union. Iran was one of the first countries that began to stand up to the Soviets when Soviets went into Afghanistan. There is good archival evidence to show that, in fact, the reason, one of the main reasons the Soviets went into Afghanistan is because they thought the US has lost a key ally in the Shah, that the US has lost a key listening center in northern Iran, where they were monitoring the Soviet Union's military nuclear program. And that's an indispensable spying installation. They're going to be looking for a replacement, and the most likely replacement is Afghanistan. We have the minutes of the Politburo where there is a discussion about going into Afghanistan. And some people say, don't go, this is not a good idea. And they eventually decide that we should go because CIA has already begun to establish contacts with the communists in Afghanistan. So Iran began to move the needle in some strange ways. The Soviet Iran was standing up to them, but the Soviets went into Afghanistan, essentially beginning the decline of the Soviet. The Chinese weren't allowed into Iran for the first 3 years. Khomeini was very angry at the Chinese because the Chinese had sided with the Shah to the detriment of everybody else. And the last head of a state to visit Iran, when nobody else would visit Iran, was the Chinese Communist Party leader and the president, Wako Feng. And the theory was the Shah is standing up to the Soviets, the Shah is standing up to American imperialism. That's why this is happening to him. These things are instigations of imperialists. We should help him. Khomeini obviously didn't like this narrative. So for the first 3 years, literally, the Chinese efforts to ingratiate themselves to Iran were rebuffed. Then the war had already begun, the war with Iraq had already begun to take its toll on Iran. Iran was in desperate need of military equipment, and Iran found willing sellers around the world. Virtually every country, including the US, France, Germany, England, Soviet Union, China, even Israel was willing to sell weapons to Iran in order to keep the war between Iran and Iraq going. Almost every country that I mentioned, I think, to their eternal moral complicity, sold, but in international relations, I guess these things don't matter. Countries have interests and they follow their interests regardless of what the moral implications are. They supplied both sides because Kissinger famously said, the longer the war goes on, the better it is for everybody else. But even Israel was willing. Israel was in 83, when they realized Iran was in desperate need, Israel was the main instigator for what became known as the Iran-Contra affair. Not because they had any friendship with Iran. They knew Iran was already trying to fight them. Iran was already in Lebanon. But they didn't want the war to end with Saddam's victory because they knew Saddam is a beast. And 83, you have the beginning of a new friendship, as they say in movies, between China and Iran. And China began to expand its relations with Iran, as did Russia. Although Iran in Afghanistan was helping the Mujahideen, the Northern Alliance, against the Soviet Union, but it was also establishing very close ties with the Soviet Union and Iran. And you begin to see this shift that today, I think, is reaching that historic moment, that, I think, tectonic shift. In 79, the idea that Saudi Arabia would have long-term big financial deals with China was unimaginable. Then in 1979, the notion that Saudi Arabia would be inching ever closer to recognizing Israel was unimaginable. In reading the archives, the American archives, I came across a letter of President Eisenhower to the Saudi king. This is mid-50s. And the king, Eisenhower says, you know, we know how much you're afraid of communists. You hate communism, and we hate communism. We need to get together, get everybody together to fight the communist threat. And the answer comes from him. He says, yeah, we're willing to do that, but you got to do something about this Israel. We can't become part of an alliance unless you do something about Israel. Now, Saudi Arabia, I think, is spearheading essentially the Middle East in the direction of a new reality where Israel, I think, in spite of every effort that Netanyahu is making to maybe render that impossible, because I think his policy in Gaza is very much working against what both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have been trying to do, which is to make peace possible between Israel and the Saudis, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, between Israel and the rest of the Muslim Middle East, with the exception of, I think, Iran. Iran is the only exception, and Iran is the biggest enemy of this alliance. But what has happened is that the US has been virtually disappearing from Iran, from the Persian Gulf, from the Middle East, I think. And you see an aggressive ascendancy by the Chinese. And you see an aggressive ascendancy by forces in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in United Arab Emirates, who see the future more in an Eastern rising power than in the US. They clearly see the US as a country, as a force, as a reality in decline. They clearly see China as a force on the rise. And although China has about 1 million Muslims in virtual concentration camps, they see no problem with that because China has their concentration camps and they don't worry about anybody else having their prisons or killing journalists or chopping up activists. The US has often has moral compunctions about some of these human rights abuses, but the Chinese don't. And for the Saudis, that seems to be a much better deal. Not only the Saudis are inching towards China, Iran is making a very clear choice, a very clear shift away, not just from the US, but from the entire Western constellation, essentially. And that's a change of almost 2,500 years. If you look at Iranian history, if you look at the classicals of Iranian history, the classical history of Iran, it has always been westward. And the West has always had a very, very remarkably close or remarkably intimate relationship with Iran. In the Bible, if you look at the Western classics of Western civilization, what are they? The Bible, Herodotus, and the classic tragedies, Greek tragedies. No country in the world is as significant to these three pieces as Iran is. Persia in the Bible, Persians are the saviors of Jews. Cyrus is the builder of Jerusalem. Cyrus is the one who frees Jews from the Babylonian captivity. Herodotus is essentially the story of Greeks fighting Iranians, Persians. And Iran is the only country outside the Greece that has at least 2, some would say 3 plays written about them, one of them called the Persians. And you move forward, Iran has always also, whether in architecture, whether in philosophical sources they seek, Iranians devoured Aristotle and Plato. In 11th century, 12th century, if you wanted to find the most sophisticated Aristotelians in the world, they were in Iran. It was called Avicenna. It was called, you call them Ibn Sina. One of the most sophisticated chemists was in Iran. They read Greek philosophy. They translated Greek philosophy. When Aristotle was not available in Western Christian churches, they were very much available in Iran. Some of Aristotle's work actually comes back to the West through the existing translations in Iran, in Arab countries. Ireland is apparently also a place, Irish monasteries. I read a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, and it claimed that, much to my consternation, of course, they claimed that it wasn't the Persians who saved civilization, it was the Irish. And then I discovered that the Irish are actually Persians, so I was confident. Irish, Ireland, there's a lot of stuff there. Don't just laugh. Don't think I'm my big fat Greek wedding father. So you fast forward. I was just part of a PhD dissertation at Stanford in the history department in art history. In Renaissance Europe, in Venice, in Florence, and in Rome, at the height of the Renaissance, the most talked about country, the most talked about country, the most coveted country, the most copied country in terms of fashion were the Persians. If you look at Shakespeare, Shakespeare has a lot of nasty things to say about Muslims, about the Turks, has nothing but praise for the Persians. Move to 19th century, look at the American transcendentalists. The American transcendentalists loved Iran. Thoreau, Emerson, they loved Saadi, they loved Hafez. Khayyam became a cultural fashion in this country in late 19th century, early 20th century. There were gentlemen clubs devoted to studying Khayyam. Now I ask my students at Stanford, la creme de la creme of students around the world, they haven't heard of Khayyam. But there was a romance with Iran, Persia, with Persian poetry. In Germany, Nietzsche called his most important work of philosophy, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra was a Persian prophet who created the Zoroastrian faith. And the faith you have, Christianity, owes an enormous amount to this Zoroastrian tradition. Read Harold Bloom's book called Omens of Millennium. It is a remarkable summary account of how much Judaism, Christianity, and Islam owe to Zoroastrianism. In late 19th century, Europe, America knew this. So there was an infatuation with Iran, and Iran was infatuated with the West. In 18th century, in 17th century America, long before there was American tension with Iran, long before there was Islamic terrorism, American colonies were infatuated with Persia. With Persia, they thought Iranians were not really Muslims. They thought the Ottomans were the bad Muslims. Iran had profound relationship with the American colonies. Iran was the biggest purchaser of something called the Boston Brew, which was a combination of whiskey and some sweet stuff. Persians, in spite of everything you read in the media today, have been a major drinker of wine. Persia was the main exporter of wine to the West till late 19th century. So there was this mutual, I say all of this to give you a sense of how interlinked Iran was to the West. Westerners towards Iran, and I can literally go on for the rest of the time talking about some of the stuff, which is fascinating, how Iranians were preoccupied with the West, and the West was preoccupied with Persians. Persians as being different than the Ottomans. The Ottomans, the Turks, were the main dangers for Europe. The Ottomans were the main dangers for Christians, and Europeans taught, Americans taught, and I think they taught rightly, the Persians really aren't Muslims. They pretend to be Muslims. That's truly, I mean, we can have a discussion about this. I teach a course at Stanford called the Iran, Islam, and the West. And I talk at some great length about how Persians essentially took Islam and made something else from it. So Europeans knew this, and Iranians had this love affair with the West. If they wanted to translate a philosopher, it was Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle was literally called the first teacher. That's how much they respected the West. Now, in Iran, we have a regime that is trying to tilt Iran completely away towards what they think is the new rising force in the world. The great decision they're making is shifting Iran, and they're trying. They're not succeeding or haven't succeeded yet because of the deep affection that people have for the West. Khamenei has been trying for 20 years to make Russian and Chinese and Arabic more popular than English. They almost banned English from all public schools. But there are more people learning English in Iran than ever before. And the West, Europe, Canada, America, if they can get the visa, New Zealand, Australia, if they can't get anywhere else, these are the major points of exit destinations, ideal destinations for Iranians. I know of no Iranian who wants to immigrate to China. I know a few who want to escape Russia, who went there. Their polls show how Iranians distrust the Russians and how little they trust the Chinese. They haven't been stabbed by the Chinese as much as they've been stabbed by Russia. So Khamenei and his forces are rewriting history. They're rewriting history to essentially underplay the role that Russia has played in Iranian history. The egregious behavior that the Russians had. I mean, it is really some of the stories about what the Russian czars did in Iran, for example, and then what the Soviets did. The Soviets tried twice to take parts of Iran and turn them into a Soviet republic. And as I said, in 1946, in Azerbaijan, if it didn't happen, it was really literally because the US, by some account, Truman directly says we made a nuclear threat ultimatum. He says, we gave an ultimatum to the Soviets, withdraw your forces or else. Remember, 46, the US has a monopoly over nuclear weapons. Russia is desperately trying to get one. And the US, according to Truman, American State Department says Truman misspoke. There wasn't a direct ultimatum, but we read them the riot act. We said, if you don't get out, you're going to pay a heavy price. But they did get out. And it's a very incredible story about how Iran convinces, with the help from Russia, with the help of the Americans, to move the Russians out of the place that they had occupied. Again, I think Iran might be certainly one of the only country. There might be one other place. My colleague, Norman Neymar, told me maybe there is one other exception. I thought Iran is the only country after World War II where the Soviets occupied their land and they gave it up. In Iran, they occupied the northern parts of Iran and were keen on creating a Soviet republic, and they were pushed out. And they desperately needed Iran because they desperately wanted to inch ever closer to the Persian Gulf, which, according to an apocryphal story, Peter has been trying to get to, Peter and the Russians have been trying to get to. Now, again, to give you a sense of what this tectonic shift is, almost any history of Iran-Russia relationship you read, or any history of Russian imperialism during the Tsars, if you read, there's a reference to something called Peter's last will. And the story is that Peter said, for Russia to survive, we need to get to the Persian Gulf, the hot waters of the Persian Gulf. We still didn't know about oil, but getting some, apparently that was apocryphal. There was no such last will, but Soviets, Russians were trying to move forward. They sort of the Persian wave of Russian expansion is one of the greatest periods of expansion in a 20-year period. As I said, they took about a third of Iran's territory. Armenia, Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, parts of Central Asia, which were all either directly controlled by Iran or were under virtual Iranian colony. But now, Iran has virtually offered a base in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, to the Chinese. And the Chinese haven't accepted. Iran has virtually offered to rent one of the most important pieces of industrial commercial real estate in the Persian Gulf, which the Chinese incidentally no longer call the Persian Gulf, called the Gulf or the Arabic Gulf, depending on where they are. If they're in Saudi Arabia, it's an Arabic Gulf. So Russia has had several joint naval operations, naval exercises with China and Iran in the Persian Gulf. That would have been unimaginable in 1975. That would have been a sort of tectonic shift. Now the Chinese can have that, and the Chinese can, I think, easily get a base across the Persian Gulf in the deals they have signed with Saudi Arabia, with United Arab Emirates. I have a student who's writing a thesis about China's influence in the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. There are 210,000 Chinese, 210,000 Chinese in United Arab Emirates. There are several dozen schools teaching Chinese in United Arab Emirates. The highest number of Americans, I told you about the domination of America in Iran before their revolution. The highest number of Americans in Iran in 1977 was about 45,000. This is included the military, the diplomatic, and their families. The Iranian population at that time was 35 million. That was thought to be a complete hegemonic presence. Now they're there. They have signed multi-hundred-billion-dollar deals with these countries, and nobody in the US seems to care. Certainly the Biden administration doesn't seem to care. The Trump administration absolutely didn't care. The Trump administration allowed Iran to attack Saudi Arabia and bring in maybe $200 billion worth of damage to Aramco. Some put it as higher, because Aramco was about to go public and they lost a lot of money and lost economic opportunities. The Trump administration essentially didn't even slap them on the hand. So MBS not only dislikes Biden, but also sees in the American, even in the Trump administration, which they like. I was just reading that MBS has invested $2 billion. In $2 billion, they have given to Jared Kushner to invest for them. it's chip change for Saudi Arabia. So that shift to me is an enormous shift. And as I said, Khamenei believes absolutely that the world is about to have a historic change. Khamenei is about to have a historic change. And that essential component of that historic change is the rise of the East and the decline of the West. The rise of authoritarianism and the decline of democracy. They're very much in line with the new views of the Communist Party of China that basically says democracy doesn't really any longer serve the purpose. Certainly, political democracy doesn't serve purpose. That's part of the new discourse, that China is more democratic than the US. They literally make that argument. It's the argument that Cuba used to make. That Cuba is more democratic because healthcare system is more democratic. The education system is more democratic. Who says political democracy is more important than economic democracy? We, in China, they say literally, we have raised 500 million people to the ranks of the middle class from poverty. What have you done for the poor recently? We, the authoritarian brotherhood, and they're all led by men. It's interesting, democracies are more often led by women. Authoritarianism, as far as I know, all of them. Maybe France will become the first authoritarian leader. French have a tendency to become the first. Iran, I think, is at the center of this shift away from the West to the East. The only, to me, promising thing is that the people of Iran don't seem to want it. Every indication I have is that that change is not favored by the people of Iran. If Khamenei and his ilk haven't yet succeeded in making this shift completely, there are two reasons. One, China hasn't really wanted it yet. China has kept Iran at an arm's length. China has signed the agreements, but they haven't invested money in Iran. China has supported Iran diplomatically, but has been very cautious not to get entangled in Iran. The other reason that it hasn't happened, I think, is the resistance of the people of Iran. I think my time is up, right? You got up? No, I'll wait. This is a good place to end. And yes, how do you do this?
You can identify out of here. Can you see the questions on the screen?
I don't have my glasses.
I don't see any questions in the chat from folks who are on the Zoom, Tom. Maybe you start one and ask other people in the room.
Questions on the chat?
There's questions here in the room.
Yes. That gentleman had his hand up first, and then you. I'm sorry.
Yes, so the Zoomers can hear you.
If you sit here. I think over the years, I think we've learned that the deep past of the civilization is highly educated in Iran, that even the women get an education. And how do you see China's influence on Saudi Arabia now being something that the Iranians would desire the same? You say a tilt to the east, that would include the Chinese influence, right? And
according to Khamenei, yes.
Yeah, so it's really a difference between the people in power and their politics rather than the cultural shift, right?
Absolutely. I think what has made the shift not work is precisely that the prevailing opinions of the people and their obvious preferences is still for an Iran that is more closely allied to the West. But I think any patriotic Iranian, for example, would say, if Iran had a reasonable, rational, independent state, not an ideological band of fools. Iran would have close relations with China, close relations with Russia, close relations with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, with the United States, with Europe, and use the tensions between these to the benefit of an independent Iran. Iran has completely limited its hands by aligning itself with Russia and China and isolating almost everybody else. And one of the remarkable documents to emerge in the last few years is a recording by Zarif, who was for 8 years Iran's foreign minister. This was supposedly part of a government oral history, not to be divulged for 40 years. Somebody decided to divulge what Zarif said. It's a 3.5-hour tape. And in it, unfortunately, I don't think there's an English translation of it yet, but I'm surprised that there isn't. If I was any US government agency that was interested in showing the tensions within Iran, I would translate that immediately and put it on for people to listen. And he says clearly, he says, China and Russia don't want a strong Iran. China and Russia were instrumental in undermining the nuclear deal. He says because China and Russia exactly want Iran where Iran is. China is now buying Iranian oil at 40% discount. They're not paying cash. They pay half of it in cash in Chinese banks. They charge a percentage, and Iran can issue lines of credit. The rest, they sell commodities that they think Iran should buy, and at prices essentially that they sell. I have a very dear friend who worked in China. And he said this in a meeting that was the kind of meeting you can't mention direct quotes, but he was extremely informed about China. He says he talked to some Chinese government official that had negotiated these deals with Iran. He says, I've never seen a government that does it like this. They basically say, okay, whatever you want, we just need the cash. And he said, this gentleman who was responsible for this, he said, you know, I go to Algeria, they bicker for every cent of the deal. These guys come and said, okay, what do you want? 40% at price? Okay. You want a 50%, you keep in your bank. You want to sell us these kind of thing at your prices. China wants Iran this way. And essentially Zarif says that, but the people of Iran don't want it. And the people of Iran are highly educated. The women of Iran are now 60% of college students. There are 2 Nobel Prize, Iranian women Nobel Prize winners. There are 2 Iranian women spacewalkers. We just had a program a month and a half ago. We being Stanford, the Iranian Studies program, we connected to the space station and talked for 15 minutes with the commander of the space station, which is an Iranian American woman. And so the people are our last best hope. Sorry. Can we go this and then go to the Zoom?
Yes.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciated the history going so far back. That was extraordinary. Thank you. So I have many questions, but I'll limit it to 2. I've heard it said that the mullahs, Khamenei, are not in control, that it's really the Revolutionary Guards. So who is really at the top? Could you comment on that? And also, could you comment on the immediate elephant in the room in Gaza and what Egypt is doing, erecting a barrier so that 1 million or 2 million people will have no place to go?
Okay, let me We start with the elephant of the room, in the room. Egypt doesn't want a displaced Palestinian on its territory. And I think they're right. The Palestinians in Gaza should live in Gaza. The idea that some country can, Mr. Netanyahu, some in his government thinks they can completely force these Gazans out of Gaza and they will live somewhere else. I think that's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. And I think it's not doing any service to the long-term interest of Israel. I think the only solution to this problem is for a Palestinian state to exist, one that accepts the existence of Israel, one that accepts the security of Israel, one that can control its borders, with an Israel that accepts that an Israel would define as a Palestinian state with defined states. And part of that is going to include the Gaza, the 2.5 million people who live there. And I completely understand that the barbarism of Hamas, when you go across the border and slaughter 1,400 people and leave a lot of evidence, pictures, that gives someone like Mr. Netanyahu a lot of weapons to work with. A lot of Israelis who used to be in favor of the two-state solution are no longer. And that's because of the criminality of the acts that were committed in those initial attacks. But now there are almost 30,000 people killed, and there are 2 million people on the verge of being displaced. The US, the closest ally of Israel, Europe, EU have all said that this policy of trying to push these people out of Gaza is not going to work. And I think Mr. Netanyahu, out of his own political interest and out of the interest of the coalition that he has, doesn't listen to his advisors, to his allies. Israel needs the United States as an ally. Israel needs Europe as an ally. And I follow what the Europeans are saying, and they are very clear that that policy, they're very clear about Hamas being a terrorist organization. That's not the question. They're very clear that Israel has the right to defend itself against these kinds of brutalities. But to me, if you accept that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and I do accept that, the second element is that the Palestinians who live in Gaza are the hostages to these terrorists. These are terrorists who absolutely don't care. Hamas doesn't care if the Israelis kill another 30,000. In fact, Hamas will be happier because Hamas doesn't care about Palestinians. Hamas doesn't care about Palestinian nation state. Hamas cares about creating an Islamic state in Gaza, and preferably in Palestine, and preferably in the world. Having said all of that, still Palestinians in Gaza have a right to exist. They need to be protected. And to say we're going to push them till they go into Egypt and Egypt better open its border, to me, doesn't. The first part of your question was about
Who's running the show?
who's running the show. That's a great question. As the rest of you probably obviously know, Iran has a political structure that is very unique. The supreme leader supposedly has all power. He is God's anointed. In a recent conversation, he even said that he is God. He said, I did really, he said, I gave a sermon once. It was really wonderful. It was very effective. I realized that it wasn't me speaking, it was God speaking. So he is occasionally, rarely God, always the viceroy of God, representative of God, and has absolute power. He has virtually absolute power in the Constitution. But in reality, power, as Mao famously said, grows out of the barrel of a gun. If the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, are the ones who now control about minimally 50% of the economy. If they don't stop the people, if they didn't stop the people a year and a half ago, when people came out in the streets, how many would have been history? Would have been, would have had a fate not unlike his cohort in Libya, Gaddafi. So it's the IRGC that is holding the line. And it's the IRGC that is an economic juggernaut. It's an IRGC that absolutely controls, for example, the foreign policy of Iran in the Middle East. It's the IRGC commanders that are ambassadors in Syria, ambassadors in Lebanon, ambassadors in Iraq, the head of the Quds Brigade, ambassador in Yemen. All of these are IRGC commanders. To me, they're the ones who call the shots. They're the ones who I think have veto power. But for the time being, Khomeini is the nominal commander-in-chief, and they defer to him. One of the great transitions in Iran, it's not a regional transition, but a local transition, is that Khomeini, as everybody knows, is sick. He has cancer. He has been with cancer for several years. And the question of who will succeed him is occupying almost everybody's mind in Iran, everybody who's following Iran. And Khomeini's clear candidate for the succession is his son. But clearly there is a lot of resistance amongst the clerics and amongst the society at large. Khomeini is on record as having said that the country that he really thinks is run efficiently is North Korea. So for the issue of succession, now whoever this current North Korean the idea, I mean, to think that if somebody had told Karl Marx when he was writing the Communist Manifesto that you would have the most corrupt, nepotistic, despotic, nationalistic, ignorant family ruling as a Marxist state, I think he would have tore up the Communist Manifesto and says, I don't want this. But
So we have a couple of questions from the Zoom audience. First question, in your opinion, does Iran want to destroy Israel? In your opinion?
Iran absolutely is on record. I don't need to give you my opinion. I can give you the facts. First, when we say Iran, we have to make sure we understand who are we talking about. If you're talking about the Iranian people, absolutely not. No country in the world, I'm choosing my words very carefully, no country in the world has had a larger Jewish population for as long as Iran has had. Iran has had a large Jewish population since 700 BC, folks. Iran, on the eve of the revolution, had 130,000 Jews in Iran, more than double of all the Muslim countries put together. Iranian Jews have lived far more peacefully in Iran than in Europe till 20th century. In 20th century, the Holocaust happened and the landscape changed. But before 20th century, Iranian Jews lived safely. This doesn't mean there wasn't anti-Semitism in Iran. There was, absolutely. But it wasn't the murderous anti-Semitism that you found in some places in Europe. There are very few pogroms. There are some, but there are very few. Jews lived, had high. So when you talk about the people of Iran, I think the people of Iran very much want peaceful relations. Iran, again, is with Turkey, the first Muslim country to de facto recognize the state of Israel. Iran de facto recognized the state of Israel in 1949. And Iran was in favor of a two-state solution almost from the beginning. So is that Iran? That's part of Iran. So Iran as a nation, I absolutely don't believe wants the destruction of the state of Israel. I think Iran as a nation wants peaceful cooperation with Israel and sees Israel as one person who comes from Iran. I absolutely think that it is the long-term strategic interest of Iran to be an ally of Israel. Absolutely. And the Shah had that. The Shah had very close relations with Israel all the way to 1979. Israel was actually in favor. Israel was in favor of Iran's nuclear program in 1975, 76, 77. When the Shah wanted to get something for his nuclear program that he couldn't get from the West, he would try to get it from Israel. Does this regime want the destruction of Israel? Absolutely, they're on record. They don't believe that Israel has a right to exist. They have been unmistakable saying, some of the regime's apologists, when Khamenei or Ahmadinejad said we should abolish Israel from the map, they said, oh no, we didn't say abolish, they said erase from the map. That's different. Give me a break. They are very open. They do not want the state of Israel to exist. But there is maybe another sub-question lurking in that question, which is a very important question, which is, will Iran, if it gets a bomb, attack Israel to destroy Israel? That's a different question. Even this regime, I think, won't do that. Not because they don't want the destruction of Israel, because they don't think they can get it. They know Israel has much more powerful arsenal. Israel has 200 more nuclear weapons. Israel has submarines with nuclear weapons right off the coast of Iran. If I know that, the Iranian regime knows that. And this regime is no longer an ideological regime in that sense. This, particularly the IRGC, which I think called the shots military, they're a kind of a mafia corporate. They want the profits. They want the economic gains. Read about some of the corruption in the highest families of the IRGC. It is remarkable. They talk about the corruption during the Shah, the royal family. There is enormous exaggeration about that, but even in the most exaggerated, the Shah, after 30 years, 35 years of 39 years of rule, reasonable number, they say, his wealth outside Iran was about $1 billion. His own family has said they had about 120 million, 130 million. Let's take the 1 billion. Literally a two-bit banker has walked with $3 billion. I really mean that. I can give you the name in Toronto. There are several billionaires, children of the IRGC, billionaires in Toronto. The son of the Speaker of the Parliament right now, Ghalibaf. He's been living a life of a prince in Canada and has fought the Canadian government. By one account, he has spent several $100,000 in lawyers' fees to sue the Canadian government to give him a permanent residency. This is the son of the IRGC commander who is head of one of the three branches. So the answer, the long, very, very long answer to your very, very good question is, it depends who you ask. If you ask the people of Iran, heck no. If you ask Khamenei, yes, if I can get away with it, but I don't think I can now.
So on the topic of the IRGC, what can the rest of the world do to help out the revolutionaries in Iran who want the mullahs and the IRGC out of power?
Again, that's, I think, a great question. There are two different kinds of things. One is, what can citizens like you do? There's something called citizen diplomacy. You have a lot of power. You have a lot of ability to help Iranian Democrats, Iranian dissidents. What the governments can do, I think, again, depending on the government. Some governments have more influence, some governments have less. But the US government, for me, has to first decide what its policy on Iran is. It really doesn't have a policy. It has policies, it has reactions, it has tactical responses. And this goes for Democrats as well as Republicans. What is the Biden strategy on Iran? I really don't know. What is the Trump strategy? Absolutely, I don't know. He talked about maximum pressure, but he also said, if you make peace with me, I'll make you the next Korea of Iran. Khamenei, the next Korea of Iran? Are you serious? Do you want that? But he also does, and then he says, I'm not going to do, if they attack, I'll destroy 52 Iranian sites, and they attack Aramco. They don't do anything. What is Biden's policy? I don't know. They go from one extreme to another. That person in charge of US policy in Iran for many years, what is now being, as we speak, is now being looked into, investigated for possible connections to the Iranian lobby. That's an incredible possibility to think about.
These answers are as good as the questions. I'm going to use the prerogative of the moderator to answer some big questions about trend lines and the trajectories or slope and how they intersect. One of them is people power. A resurgence of the Arab Spring, including spreading into Iran. The people in the region finally having had it with the incompetent governance typical of the region. A second is the sustainability of economies that are predicated on a single commodity that most of the world wants us to use less of. That there have been, my judgment, no successes in broadening the economy away from these rentier. So that's the second. A third, you, I think, accurately put a lot of emphasis on the region turning to China. I think partly in Iran's case from money, partly to put pressure on the United States to have a policy that play one big guy off against another big guy. But the Chinese pattern everywhere is give them a little bit of time and they'll alienate everybody. That the expectations for what China is going to do are exaggerated. So that, and the third has to do with Russia and China gaining or regaining influence in the region by cozying up to really unpopular leaders. That if the people power displaces, if the economic performance leads to the erosion of the regime, almost certainly the successor is going to want to disentangle or turn away from the current seeming rising power. Now, if what I've described is more or less accurate, which happens soonest? Or these all kind of indeterminate, and given the amount of indeterminacy, should the United States have a clear, consistent policy? And if so, predicated on what?
Well, these are great transition questions. Let me try to address some of them. There are two forces in the Middle East, as far as I understand it, that fought people's power in Iran and in the Arab Spring. Those two countries were Saudi Arabia and Iran. Those two countries are each other's enemies, but they're both enemies of people's power. MBS and the rest of the Arab-rich monarchies spend a lot of money defeating people power. Iran equally spent bullets to destroy people's power in Iran and used all of its power in the region to do away with that. In Iran, it hasn't worked. I think in the case of Iran, the regime has established tactical supremacy over the disturbances and the uprisings, whatever you want to call it, the revolution of the last 2 years. But I think that's very much tactical. The trend line is towards economic hardship. The trend line is towards them having no choice but to limit some of the subsidies on gasoline, the subsidies on gas, the subsidies on the price of bread, tea. These are essential subsidies. Minimally, by the government's account, 50% of the Iranians are now living at the poverty line. The price of Iranian currency went from 7 Persian Tuma to $1 to now 57,000 Tuma to $1.
Wow.
People actually get paid in Tuma, and the prices are in dollar. So that's how much standard of living for the masses of the people, not the poor, the rich. The rich have become fantastically rich. So the trend line, I think, is for economic difficulties to increase. And the trend line is for Iran to lose even that one economy, that one source of the rentier. Iran used to be dependent on oil, but it's losing its market share, it's losing its market share in gas. Again, to give you a sense of how dependence on Russia essentially helped doom this regime. Anybody knew, as tensions between Iran, the US, Europe, and Russia were increasing, that gas is going to be a main commodity in Europe. United Arab Emirates, Qatar, everybody else in the region began gearing up for that. Iran was the only country. Iran is the second biggest holder of gas reservoirs in the world. Iran didn't even move in that direction. I interviewed someone who was the director of the Iranian oil company. He said, we knew this was happening, so we said, let's start investing in ways to export this gas. And he said, the IRGC came and said, no, we don't want to do this. And if we do it, we want to do it. And they didn't do it. So they're going to lose that. What Iran has is a remarkable human capital. What Iran has is a remarkable, powerful diaspora. The Iranian diaspora is now estimated to be worth about $1 trillion with a T. The company, he introduced me, I am the Hamid and Christina Mogaddam Director of Iranian Studies. Hamid Mogaddam is the founder of a company now called Prologos. Prologos is the biggest industrial real estate company in the world. It is publicly traded. Its worth is $150 billion. There are many, many other very successful Iranians whose heart is still with Iran. They would do for an Iranian post-transition what I think American Jews did for Israel in 1940s, 50s. They helped economic transition. So the trend line to me is more economic hardship for this regime, more tension at the populist level, more suppression, and then Khamenei dies. Even clergy die, although they don't die normal human lives. They have longer lives, Shiite clergy, because they really take good care of themselves, not athletically. They eat well, they sleep a lot. And those are the two essential components of it. They don't have anxiety because I think they think they're doing God's work. So, but even they die. And I think once that happens, then Iran has to make a choice. It will either go towards military dictatorship a la IRGC, or it will go in the direction of recognizing that the status quo is untenable and that the new national, essentially, alliance between diaspora and Iran has to be formed. I don't mean that the Iranian diaspora will be the political leadership. I don't mean that the prince or the activist or the feminist from the West are going to be the future leaders of Iran. The future leaders of the Iranian opposition are inside Iran. They're the ones who are fighting this regime, who have paid with blood, with time, and are fighting. And they're remarkable. I mean, to me, that's the trend line. And what the U.S., you said, what should the U.S. policy be? I think the U.S. has to decide whether it thinks this regime will survive. Does it want this regime to survive? If it doesn't want this regime to survive, how do you go about making sure that its life is short? They need, literally, I think once when you were kindly came to my class, I said this several years ago, they need sort of a X-letter containment telegram, the famous George Kennan telegram, who in 1946, he said, Soviet Union is a cancerous growth, but it's a corrupt cancerous growth. If you contain it, it'll die. This is how you contain it. Does the US think this is a country that is cancerous? I believe it is. The US strategy and the European strategy, sadly, and you correct me if I'm wrong, and I defer to you in all of these things because you have experience and you have knowledge. But the US strategy for the last 44 years is that if you show enough conciliation towards this regime, if you give them some concessions, they will behave. And for 44 years, they haven't behaved. They have become more egregious. They take American dual citizens, Iranian citizens, European dual citizens as hostages and exchange them with terrorists. You say, why? Well, because they've done it, and for 43 years, they've gotten the response. The US has traded with them. Ronald Reagan said, we will never trade with terrorists. And they made the Iran-Contra deal. The Europeans do it regularly. Regularly. I can list all the terrorists who were released and gone back to Iran to a hero's welcome in exchange for the release of hostages. So if the US decides that this is, it might decide, really, I'm not being facetious, it might decide we can't get rid of this regime, and this regime has these possibilities, we should try to get maybe the IRGC, help the IRGC, because the IRGC might be less of a venomous presence than the clergy, for example. But to me, in all the conversations that I've had, and I've tried to read the documents that come out, they have tactical responses to emergencies. And they have tactical responses to the nuclear deal. Look what Iran has done in the nuclear negotiations. They have outmaneuvered, outlied, outcheated the West, and are now, I think, literally weeks from a bomb. Go back to how they have managed this. I dislike this regime profoundly, but I watch it and I see, well, I know why they're doing this. They're fooling the US. This is where they're going. They're not going to abide by this. You know, the US was told at one time during the Obama administration, I'm sure you know about this much better than I do, that Khamenei has issued a fatwa. Fatwa is a religious ruling against the bomb. And thus, he will never get the bomb. Don't worry about it. Make the deal. Whoever told this to the US is a criminal. Because if you know the first thing about Shiism, it is that a fatwa is changeable. Fatwa is not a non-changing thing. A fatwa is a religious ruling. There was a fatwa against a woman going to school. There was a fatwa against radio, a fatwa against television. The most famous fatwa, there was a 1,000-year-old fatwa against caviar. And Khomeini came to power. Literally, you laugh. It's funny. But it's also educational. Khomeini came to power and they said, Your Highness, this is a multi-million-dollar business. We can't just let it go. So, well, maybe we should study this more. So they studied it more and they said, well, we have discovered a new bone structure to sturgeon. And caviar, banned for 1,300 years, was suddenly kosher. The nuclear bomb, the fatwa on nuclear can flip overnight. There is a concept that Shiites have. It's called taqiyya. Taqiyya means lying in the service of faith. You not only can do it, you must do it. It's an obligation. They asked Khomeini, said, you know, in Paris when you were being interviewed, you said they're not going to put veil on women. Now you're putting, what did you do? How did you do that? So, well, I was lying at the time. So with that regime, you're going to believe that Khamenei has issued, although that fatwa has never been found, incidentally. But even if there was one, what does a fatwa mean? It means nothing. Khomeini, just a year and a half ago, a cleric, one of the top clerics, he said, you know, we told these Americans that, laughingly, he said, you told them that there is a fatwa. Apparently they didn't know that Khamenei can issue a fatwa tomorrow and make it mandatory to have a bomb. So you need to understand, the US needs to understand the nature of this phenomenon. This is a very different phenomenon than anything I think. But I teach, the time is up, I think, because Tom told me we close at 8:30. I teach a course of US Iranian politics this quarter. And I tell my students, I said, every form of government that you study in comparative politics, Iran has had some experience with it in 20th century. But this one is sui generis. It's unlike anything else. And unless the West understands the singularity and the singular danger of this regime, it is not going to be able to develop a strategy. And unless you develop a strategy, you're going to get outplayed. Thank you.
The length of the applause, I think, says more effectively than I could. It was a terrific presentation, response to questions. Thanks to the people on Zoom for being with us for the questions from there. Thanks to everyone who was in attendance. Next week's session will be led by me. It's on U.S.-China rivalry and the impact that that has or could have on strategic metals and minerals and transition to greener energy technologies. I didn't think much of the article that was in the workbook. Not a reason for you not to read it if you haven't, but I'm going to go in a different direction than the author does for that. But
I might become a Methodist just to come to listen to that.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Good night. All.
Thank you.
Really, I'd like to get everything.
Yes, just as a reminder to everybody on Zoom, the program starts at 7 o'clock. The 6:30 referenced in the Zoom invitation is an artifact of Zoom only. This meeting starts at 7 o'clock and we admit people into the Zoom meeting approximately 5 minutes before 7. So we'll see you all next week.